My name is Elena Marsh, and after 15 years of marriage, I never imagined that the man who once promised to love me forever would be the one to sit across from me at our kitchen table, refuse to look me in the eye, and tell me he wanted a divorce. It was a Tuesday. I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else from that night, because Tuesdays were supposed to be ordinary. I had made chicken soup because the weather had turned cold, and Daniel had come home 20 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, except that he didn't take off his coat. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen like a stranger deciding whether he was allowed to come inside his own home. "Elena," he said, "we need to talk." I have learned since then that those 4 words are rarely followed by anything good. I set down the ladle. I remember the sound it made against the pot, a small metallic clink that somehow felt louder than it should have. "Okay," I said. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He pulled out the chair across from me, the one he always sat in, the one with the slightly loose leg that wobbled if you leaned back too far, and he sat down like his body weighed twice as much as usual. "I think we should get a divorce. I want to tell you that I said something clever. Something composed. The truth is that I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my mind simply refused to process the sentence as real. 15 years. 2 mortgages. A shared bank account. A dog we'd buried together in the backyard 3 years earlier, both of us crying in the rain. 15 years, and he said it the way you'd mentioned that the car needed an oil change. "You're joking," I said. "I'm not." "Daniel, what is going on? Did something happen? Did I do something?" "It's not about anything you did." He was still staring at the table, at a spot just to the left of my hand. "I think we've grown apart. I think I've been unhappy for a while now. I need to find myself again. I want to be honest about something." In the years since that night, I have turned that sentence over in my mind so many times that I could probably recite it in my sleep. I need to find myself again. At the time, it sounded like the vague, empty language of a man who simply didn't want to explain himself. Now I understand that it was worse than vague. It was a sentence built entirely out of things that weren't true, stacked carefully on top of each other, so that the one true thing underneath would never have to see daylight. 15 years, Daniel. 15 years, and that's what you're giving me? You've been unhappy. It's complicated. Then uncomplicate it. Tell me what happened. He finally looked up at me, and for one moment, just one, I saw something in his eyes that didn't match his words. It wasn't the look of a man who had fallen out of love. It was the look of a man who was afraid. Not afraid of me. Afraid of something much bigger than the 2 of us sitting in that kitchen. "There isn't anything else to tell," he said. "I just don't feel the way I used to." That was when I noticed the folder. It was sitting on the counter behind him, tucked half beneath the mail we hadn't sorted yet, a manila folder with a corner of paper sticking out just enough for me to catch the header. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He had already been to a lawyer. Not that week. Not that day. The paperwork was too clean, too complete, the kind of document that takes weeks to prepare, not hours. While I had been making dinner plans and picking out paint samples for the guest room, my husband had been quietly building the walls of an exit. "How long?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "How long have you been planning this?" "Elena." "How long, Daniel?" His phone buzzed on the table between us. He looked down at it the way a man looks down at a snake, and then, without a word of explanation, he picked it up, stood, and walked out onto the back porch to answer it. Through the glass door, I watched him talk in a low, urgent voice, his free hand raking through his hair, his shoulders tight around his ears. I couldn't hear the words. I could only see the shape of his fear. I sat alone at our kitchen table with a pot of soup going cold and a folder full of legal paper 12 feet away, and I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice water, that whatever was happening to my marriage had started long before that Tuesday. I just didn't know yet how far back it went, or how much it would cost me to find out. To understand how much that night broke me, you have to understand what came before it. I met Daniel Marsh when I was 26 years old, waiting tables at a small Italian restaurant to help pay off my graduate school loans. He came in with 2 friends from his construction firm, ordered the same thing every week for a month, and it took him 3 of those visits before he worked up the nerve to ask for my number instead of his check. He was not a flashy man. He was steady. He showed up early, remembered small details, and had a way of making you feel like the only person in a crowded room. When my father died 2 years into our relationship, Daniel took a week off work he couldn't afford to take, drove me 11 hours to my childhood home, and stood beside me at the funeral holding my hand so tightly I had bruises the next morning. I didn't mind. I needed something to hold on to, and he was it. We got married in a small backyard ceremony because that was all we could afford, and I remember thinking, standing there in a dress my mother had altered herself, that I had never been so certain of anything in my life. The first 5 years were hard in the ordinary ways that young marriages are hard. Money was tight. Daniel was building his construction business from nothing with his college friend Marcus Whitfield, and there were months we ate rice and beans because every spare dollar went into the company. I remember one Christmas where our entire gift to each other was a promise, written on index cards, to buy something nicer the following year. We survived a miscarriage together in our 6th year of marriage, a loss that nearly broke us both, and somehow, instead of pulling apart, we held on tighter. By year 10, Marsh and Whitfield Construction had become a real company, with real contracts and a real office downtown. We bought the house on Larkspur Lane, the one with the crooked oak tree in the backyard that Daniel swore he'd take down and never did. We had built something. Not just a company, not just a house. A life, brick by brick, the same way Daniel built everything else, with patience and stubbornness and a kind of quiet devotion that I mistook, foolishly, for permanence. So when he told me he wanted out, it didn't just feel like losing a husband. It felt like discovering that the house I lived in for 15 years had been standing on a foundation that was never actually there. In the weeks that followed his announcement, Daniel moved out of our bedroom and into the guest room, but he did not move out of the house. He said it was for practical reasons, something about not wanting to disrupt things until we'd figured out the details. I told myself I was grateful for that. In truth, it was agony, watching him each morning make his coffee in our kitchen like a man passing through a life that no longer belonged to him. That was when the strange thing started. His phone, which had never had a passcode in 15 years of marriage, suddenly did. When I asked him about it, almost as a joke, he mumbled something about work security requirements and wouldn't meet my eyes. He started taking calls outside. Always outside, always with the door shut behind him, his voice dropping into that low, careful register I had only ever heard him use with difficult clients. He began sleeping with his laptop on the nightstand beside him in the guest room instead of leaving it downstairs like he always had. Once, I walked in to bring him a cup of coffee, and he slammed the lid shut so fast that the coffee spilled over my hand. He apologized. He didn't explain. I noticed the emails, or rather, I noticed him noticing them. He'd glance at his phone at dinner, his jaw would tighten, and he'd excuse himself from the table. When I asked who kept messaging him, he said it was just work stuff, in a tone that made it clear the conversation was closed. He started coming home later. Not much later. An hour, sometimes 2. When I asked where he'd been, he said meetings ran long. I had been married to a construction executive for 15 years. I knew what his meetings sounded like when they ran long, and this wasn't that. And then there was the money. I found it by accident, the way you find most things you weren't supposed to see. I was looking for our tax documents in the small filing cabinet in his home office, and I found a bank statement for an account I didn't recognize. Not a joint account. Not one of the business accounts I knew about. A private account, opened 8 months earlier, with transfers coming in and out in amounts that made my stomach drop. $30,000, moved in March. $22,000, moved in May. Money leaving accounts I knew, appearing in this one, and then disappearing again into places I couldn't trace. I sat on the floor of his office with that statement in my hands and I thought, with a kind of numb, exhausted clarity, there is another woman. It was the only story that made sense to me at the time. A private account. Late nights. Secret calls. A man suddenly desperate to end a 15-year marriage without explaining why. I had read enough, heard enough from friends whose marriages had ended the same way, to believe I finally understood what was happening to mine. I decided that night that I would find her. I am not proud of what I did next, but I don't regret it either. I started paying attention the way I hadn't let myself pay attention before. I wrote down the license plates of unfamiliar cars near his office. I watched his calendar app when he left it open on the kitchen counter. I noticed a recurring appointment, 3 times over 2 weeks, labeled only with the initials RC, at a coffee shop across town, a place we had never been together in 15 years of marriage. On a Thursday afternoon, I told Daniel I was going to visit my sister. Instead, I drove to that coffee shop and sat in my car in the parking lot like a woman in a bad movie, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, until I saw his truck pull in. He walked inside and sat down across from a woman I didn't recognize. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp blazer, a leather folder on the table between them. They spoke for nearly 40 minutes. At one point, Daniel put his head in his hands, and the woman reached across the table and placed her hand over his wrist, just for a moment, in a gesture that could have meant comfort or could have meant something else entirely. I sat in that parking lot and felt something in me break clean in half. I didn't confront him that day. I told myself I needed proof, needed to know her name before I said anything, but the truth is I was terrified. Terrified that if I said the words out loud, they would become real in a way I couldn't undo. It took me another week to learn her name. I followed his truck once more, watched her walk to her own car, and wrote down her license plate. A friend of mine who worked at the DMV owed me a favor from years back, and 3 days later, I had a name. Rachel Cho. I searched everything I could find about her, my hands trembling over the keyboard at 2 in the morning while Daniel slept, or pretended to sleep, down the hall. And what I found was not what I expected. Rachel Cho was not a mistress. She was a forensic accountant. I sat with that information for a long time before I understood what it meant, and even then I didn't understand all of it. A forensic accountant. Not a woman my husband was building a new life with. A woman who investigated fraud. The question in my mind shifted, the way a photograph shifts when you finally adjust the focus. It was no longer who is she. It became what is she looking for, and why is my husband so afraid of what she might find? I thought about the private account. The unexplained transfers. The late nights. The locked phone. None of it fit the story of an affair anymore. It fit something else, something I hadn't let myself consider, because it was in some ways more frightening than infidelity. Something was wrong with the business. I thought back, then, to things I had let myself forget. 3 years earlier, our longtime company accountant, a soft-spoken man named Walter Ibbotson who had done our books since the company's earliest days, had abruptly quit. He gave 2 weeks' notice, cleaned out his desk, and never once returned Daniel's calls afterward. At the time, Daniel told me Walter had taken a position out of state, something about wanting to be closer to his grandchildren. I remembered being surprised, because Walter had never once mentioned grandchildren in the 8 years I'd known him. I remembered, too, a strange evening about 4 years ago, when Daniel came home pale and quiet after a dinner with Marcus, and when I asked what was wrong, he said only, "Marcus wants to expand faster than I'm comfortable with," and never brought it up again. I remembered a family trip to Portugal that Daniel refused to take, insisting the business couldn't spare him, even though Marcus took his own family to Italy that same summer without any apparent difficulty. I remembered my mother, at Thanksgiving years ago, pulling me aside after one too many glasses of wine and saying, "I don't trust that Marcus. There's something about him. You be careful, Elena," and I had laughed it off as an old woman's suspicion. None of these things had seemed connected at the time. Now, laid out together in my mind like puzzle pieces on a table, they began, faintly, to form a shape. I decided I needed to talk to someone who knew the business, someone who wasn't Daniel and wasn't Marcus. I thought of Walter Ibbotson. It took me 2 weeks and considerably more effort than I'm proud of to track him down. He hadn't moved out of state at all. He was living 90 minutes away, working as a bookkeeper for a small furniture store, a job well beneath what a man of his experience should have been doing. I showed up at his shop on a Saturday morning without calling first, afraid that if I gave him warning, he'd refuse to see me. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, and when he saw me standing in his doorway, something in his face went carefully blank. "Elena," he said, "I wondered if you'd ever come. Why did you really leave Walter?" He was quiet for a long moment, glancing past me toward the empty store as though checking for anyone who might be listening. "I think you already know it wasn't grandchildren," he said finally. "Tell me." "I can't. I signed something when I left. A settlement. If I talk about company finances, I lose everything I have left. Walter, please. I think my marriage is falling apart because of something you know." He studied me for a long time, and something in my face must have convinced him, because he sighed and gestured for me to sit down on an overturned crate near the register. "I'll tell you what I can, and not one word more," he said. "Marcus Whitfield has been moving money through the company for years. Not big enough to notice at first. A little here, a little there, hidden in supply costs, in subcontractor fees that never quite added up. By the time I noticed the pattern, it wasn't small anymore. It was millions. Millions. I brought it to Daniel first. Years ago. He didn't want to believe it. Marcus was his oldest friend, his business partner since college. Daniel confronted him privately, and Marcus swore he'd fix it, pay it back quietly, keep it from ever becoming a legal problem. I told Daniel it wasn't that simple. That money like that doesn't just disappear and reappear. Daniel made me an offer to stay quiet and keep working while he tried to handle it internally. I couldn't do it. I have a conscience, Elena, even if it cost me my career. So I left, and I signed the paper they put in front of me, and I've been quiet ever since. Why didn't anyone tell me? Walter's eyes softened, the closest thing to pity I'd ever seen on his face. Because Daniel didn't want you anywhere near it. He was terrified of what would happen to you if the truth ever came out. Elena, if this goes to court, if regulators get involved, everything the two of you own together could be at risk. Your house. Your savings. All of it. I drove home that day with my hands shaking on the wheel for the second time in a month, but this time for an entirely different reason. In the days after speaking with Walter, I couldn't stop replaying our marriage in my head like a film I'd watched 100 times, except now I was noticing details I'd somehow missed on every previous viewing. I remembered the year Daniel started coming home smelling faintly of the cheap coffee from a downtown parking garage instead of his office espresso machine, and how he'd waved off my questions by saying he'd been meeting a new supplier. I remembered a night, maybe 5 years back, when I'd found him standing in the dark in our home office at 2 in the morning, staring at a spreadsheet on his laptop, and how he'd told me it was nothing, just year-end numbers, and closed it before I could see. I remembered the argument we'd had over whether to refinance the house, how he'd resisted for months before finally agreeing, and how relieved he'd seemed once the paperwork was signed, as though he'd been holding his breath the entire time. None of these moments had seemed significant on their own. Stacked together now, they read like a man quietly building a levee against a flood only he could see coming. I also went back through old photographs, the way people do when they're trying to locate the exact moment something started to break. In a picture from a company holiday party 6 years earlier, Marcus had his arm around Daniel's shoulders, both of them laughing at something off camera, and Patricia stood just behind them, half in shadow, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Now I wondered how long the three of them had been carrying secrets around each other at parties where I was laughing along, completely unaware. I confronted Daniel that night, though not with everything I knew. I wanted to see what he would tell me on his own if given the chance. I know about Marcus, I said. I know about the money. He went very still. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? He sat down heavily on the edge of the guest bed, his head in his hands. It's more complicated than you think. Then explain it to me. For once in your life, Daniel, just explain it to me. Rachel Cho is a forensic accountant. I hired her 8 months ago, quietly, to help me build a case against Marcus. Real evidence. Enough to go to the authorities without the whole company and everything we own getting dragged down with him. So the private account is money I've been setting aside, protecting, in case this goes badly and the company's assets get frozen or seized. I didn't want it connected to our joint accounts because if Marcus's fraud gets traced through the business, I was afraid everything tied to us could be at risk too. And the divorce? He looked up at me then, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the man I had married looking back at me instead of a stranger wearing his face. If this goes to court, Elena, and it's going to, I could lose everything. The company, the house, maybe even my freedom if a prosecutor decides I should have caught it sooner and didn't. I couldn't let you go down with me. I thought if we were legally separated, if our finances were legally separate, you'd be protected no matter what happens to me. You were going to divorce me to protect me? And you didn't think, even once, to just tell me the truth? I didn't want you to carry this. I've watched what it's done to me for 4 years. The stress, the fear, waking up every night wondering if today's the day it all falls apart. I didn't want that for you. I thought it would be easier if you just believed I'd stopped loving you. I thought that would hurt less than the truth. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through my chest, anger and grief, and something almost like tenderness all tangled together. You don't get to decide what hurts less for me, Daniel. That was never your decision to make. He didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there was one. That night ended without resolution. Daniel slept, or didn't sleep, in the guest room, and I lay awake in the bed we'd shared for 15 years, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide which version of my anger was the truest one. Was I angry that he lied, or angry that his lie had been, in some twisted way, an act of love I hadn't asked for and didn't want? I still don't have a clean answer to that question. I'm not sure there is one. I want to tell you that learning the truth fixed everything, that I forgave him on the spot, and we rebuilt our marriage stronger than before. That isn't what happened, and I think you deserve the honest version more than the comfortable one. What happened instead is that I got angry. Truly angry, in a way I hadn't let myself be during all those weeks of suspicion and fear. Angry that he had decided, alone, what I could and couldn't handle. Angry that 4 years of my marriage had been quietly poisoned by a secret I never got the chance to face beside him. Angry that I had spent weeks convinced I wasn't loved anymore, grieving a version of the truth that wasn't even real, when the actual truth was sitting right there the whole time, hidden behind a door he refused to open. But there was more still to uncover, and it came from a place I never expected. 2 weeks after our conversation, I met with Rachel Cho directly. I wanted to hear the rest from someone who wasn't emotionally tangled in it the way Daniel and I were. She agreed to meet me, cautiously at first, clearly aware of how strange the request must have seemed. Your husband didn't just discover this recently, Rachel told me, sliding a folder across the table between us, much like the one Marcus's fraud had apparently been dressed up in for years. The irregularities go back nearly 7 years. Small amounts at first, then larger. What I found troubling wasn't just the scale of it. It's the pattern. What do you mean? Someone inside the company has been helping Marcus cover his tracks. Not Daniel. Someone with access to your personal financial records, someone who knew things about your household finances that wouldn't normally be visible to a business partner. You check a name for me, I asked. Patricia Vance. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I already knew the answer before she gave it to me. Elena, Rachel said quietly, I was hoping I wouldn't have to be the one to tell you this. Patricia had been having a financial affair with Marcus for years, not romantic in nature, but nearly as devastating in its betrayal. Marcus had approached her 6 years ago, when her own small business was drowning under debt, and offered to quietly funnel her enough money to keep it afloat in exchange for information. Information about our family's finances. Information that helped him disguise his fraud as legitimate transfers between family accounts. She hadn't known, or claimed not to know, the full scale of what he was doing with it. She had told herself it was harmless, a favor between friends, a business arrangement that had nothing to do with me. I confronted her at her home on a Sunday afternoon, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. She cried before I even finished my first sentence. She told me she never meant for it to go this far, that Marcus had promised it was temporary, that she had been desperate and ashamed and hadn't known how to stop once she'd started. "You used my father's death," I said. "You used my grief to help that man steal from my family, and you sat across from me at Thanksgiving every year and said nothing. Elena, please, you have to understand. I don't have to understand anything. I have to leave. I want to be honest and tell you that I have not spoken to Patricia since that day, and I don't know if I ever will again. Some betrayals leave a door open, even if it's cracked only slightly. This one, for me, closed completely." The weeks that followed were consumed by lawyers, though not divorce lawyers. Rachel's evidence, combined with Walter's willingness to finally testify openly now that Marcus's fraud had been formally exposed, gave prosecutors what they needed to build a real case. Marcus Whitfield was arrested on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement 4 months after that Tuesday night in our kitchen. Patricia was never charged criminally, but she lost her business anyway when the arrangement collapsed, and I heard, secondhand, that she moved out of state not long after. Daniel and I did not simply return to the marriage we'd had before. I want to be honest about that, because I think too many stories like this end with a tidy bow that real life rarely offers. We went to therapy, separately at first, and then together. I told him, in the rawest terms I could find, how much damage his silence had done, how the 4 years he spent protecting me from the truth were 4 years he also spent lying to me, even if the lies came from love instead of malice. He told me how afraid he'd been, not just of prison or bankruptcy, but of watching me look at him the way I was looking at him now, with equal parts love and distrust tangled together in the same breath. We didn't rush back into the life we'd built before. We rebuilt it slower this time, more honestly, with fewer things left unsaid. It took the better part of a year before I stopped flinching every time his phone buzzed at the dinner table. I won't tell you it's perfect now. I don't believe marriages that survive something like this ever go back to being what they were. But I will tell you that for the first time in years, I understand exactly what my husband is carrying, because he finally lets me carry some of it with him. Looking back now, more than a year removed from that Tuesday night, I think about the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table, watching a folder of divorce papers peek out from beneath our unsorted mail, and I feel an unexpected tenderness toward her. She didn't know yet that the story she was about to live through wasn't the one she thought it was. She believed she was losing her husband to another woman, when in truth, she was about to discover that the greatest threat to her marriage had never been a stranger at all. It had been silence. 15 years of a good marriage nearly destroyed, not by betrayal in the way I originally feared, but by a man who loved me enough to lie to me, and a friend who betrayed me quietly enough that I never saw it coming. Some of what I built with Daniel over those 15 years was real. The wedding in my mother's altered dress, the week he took off work to sit beside me at my father's funeral, the nights we ate rice and beans and dreamed out loud about a future we could barely afford to imagine. Those things happened. That love was not a lie. But I understand now, in a way I never fully did before, that you cannot build a life on someone else's secrets, no matter how lovingly those secrets are kept. A marriage cannot survive on protection alone. It survives on truth, even when the truth is frightening, even when it would be so much easier to let the person you love carry the weight of it by yourself. I stayed with Daniel, in the end, not because he asked for a divorce and I refused to let him go, but because once the truth was finally out in the open, we chose each other again, honestly this time, with nothing left hidden between us. If there's one thing I would want another woman sitting where I once sat, staring across a kitchen table at a husband she no longer recognizes, to understand, it's this: the truth, however painful, is always survivable. It's the silence that breaks you. And, sometimes, the life you're terrified of losing was never the one you were meant to keep. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose it entirely before you can find out what's actually worth rebuilding. That Tuesday night, I thought my marriage was ending. In truth, it was only just beginning to become honest. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Marrie Tales for more emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable endings.